fact that we have a social care system that is very underfunded. But I also think there are some things that we can do under the current funding envelope which would make better use of the services. But I have to say the government needs to address this as a national priority, needs to have a national strategy, and any amount of localism or deciding on giving local authorities the ability to raise a precept, for example, is a piecemeal and fragmented approach. And I think what we need is a national health service and a national care service that are interdependent and support each other.
The government, of course, says it's put in place extra funding for the NHS as it was asked to do. You mentioned, though, just then that there are things that could be done now, such as?
Well, I think one of the things that could happen is any hospital that is looking and has a problem with its delayed discharge should look into its local community, see if there are any care home beds, and should make direct representation to those care homes to see whether or not they can buy those beds for reablement, convalescence, step up, step down care. So there are some things that could be done immediately. But part of the problem is, of course, healthcare is free at the point of need, social care is means tested. So the moment you start moving people from one bit of the system to another, a fight breaks out between the local authority and the NHS over who is going to pay for it. And what we've got to do is recognise that the money in health and social care is taxpayers' money, and it should be used for the benefit of citizens, not systems.
That's an interesting point, Professor Mahood, and I was going to ask you, what kind of impact do you see this all having on patients, the people that you're treating?
Well, patients generally, when they're fit and ready to go home, don't like to stay in hospital, and it can become very frustrating for them. People tend to become physically frailer. They can lose muscle mass if they remain in hospital and remain inactive. And so both psychologically and physically, it could have a negative impact on patients. But the British Geriatric Society, we also urge the government to have a national strategic plan for older people who are actually frail, also with dementia, also with complex needs, and with long-term conditions, because I think that's the only way forward that we're going to address this issue of the demographic trend which Professor Green talked about earlier.
And just a final question for you both. Professor Mahood, if I stay with you for a moment, what about the suggestion that families should be taking on more responsibility of looking after their elderly relatives? How realistic is that?
Well, I think that's an issue for society and individual families. In the last couple of decades or more, we have moved away from the responsibilities that we have to our parents and grandparents, and it seems to be becoming the norm that if patients are struggling at home, that we think about care homes. But clearly older patients would like, if possible, to remain in their own homes, and one way is, of course, social services and trying to get some extra funding for them to try and get more carers to be able to look after older people. But I think as a society we also have to reevaluate, what do we want for our older people, and the government, I think, has a role to play in perhaps facilitating people who might be able to help in the care of their parents or grandparents for them to be able to do so.
Well, the government facilitating people to help, should it be made compulsory, for example? Let's talk radically. Should people be made to look after their elderly relatives in order to ease the pressures on the NHS?
No, certainly not. I think what we've got to realise is that we're in a very different world now. So, for example, you will find people who, through divorce and a range of other issues, might have 4 or 5 older people dependent upon them. We've got geographical mobility. We've already seen with the housing crisis that the housing is not appropriate for small families, never mind the added burdens of looking after somebody. There's also something to remember, which is about the change in the relationship that happens when you become a carer. And I think we should also acknowledge, though, that in this discussion about families taking on more responsibility, what we need to remember is that families shoulder the majority of responsibility. And if you look at how many informal carers there are that are delivering huge amounts of care, we're in a crisis now, but without them we would be in an absolute catastrophe. And I think that the government should look at this from the point of view of having a long-term strategy rather than easy sound bites.
Professor Martin Green, Professor Tahir Massoud. We must leave it there. Thank you to you both. Thanks.